Welcome everybody to the last event of the Clapham Book Festival. Very proud to be hosting this evening as Time and Leisure, the media partners for Clapham Book Fest. I'm Lucy Kane, the owner of Time and Leisure magazine, and delighted to see so many people here this evening. It's fantastic. Obviously this evening we're very excited to have Ben Macintyre with us in conversation with Simon. So welcome to everybody. A brief introduction. Simon, who's going to be in conversation, is a BAFTA-winning documentary maker and a journalist. Simon's World War II histories, Warlords and Allies at War, have received critical and popular acclaim, with the latter being turned into a major BBC history series. An erstwhile Clapham resident, his latest Westminster thriller, A Time to Lie, was published in 2020. Brilliant, a wonderful, devilishly entertaining page turner, said Talk Radio. He has also published The Inquiry as Will Kane. So Simon will be talking to Ben, who is also a columnist and associate editor at The Times, and has also been the newspaper's correspondent in New York, Paris and Washington. He is the author of 9 previous books, including Agent Zigzag, shortlisted for the Costa Biography Award. In 2019, The Spy and the Traitor, which tells the story of double KGB agent Oleg Gordievsky, was a No.1 Sunday Times Bestseller and shortlisted for the Ballie Gifford Prize and the National Book Awards. John Le Carre is a big fan. He said it was the best spy story, the best real spy story he'd ever read. Ben's new book, which we'll be talking about this evening, Agent Sonya, Lover, Mother, Soldier, Spy, tells the story of Ursula Kuczynski, the greatest female spy of the 20th century. So we look forward to hearing all about that and perhaps some of his previous novels. So I will introduce Simon and Ben. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Ben, welcome. Thank you. It's sometimes hard to know quite where to start with your work because you're so extremely prolific. And I've decided reading them, you must be extraordinarily hardworking to not only do the journalism, but the books. But let's start with Agent Sonya, which I've finished a couple of days ago and massively enjoyed because it was such a wonderful character and a tremendous sweep of history too, of 20th century history, and took you to places you never quite imagined you might go. So how did she, it's based on Ursula Kuczynski, this great spy of the first half of the 20th century. How did she come into your life?
Well, as with all these strange stories, really, largely by accident. I was researching a completely different topic. I was looking at a particular American operation that took place towards the end of the Second World War, where they were beginning to parachute anti-Nazi spies into the Third Reich as it was collapsing. And they were recruiting in Britain mostly, oddly enough, mostly in Hampstead. They were recruiting a lot of former German trade unionists who were ferocious opponents of Hitler and training them up and parachuting them into the Third Reich. What they didn't know was that, in fact, most of these Germans that they were recruiting were communists. And they had been put forward by this shadowy woman. Nobody ever really knew who she was. And certainly the recruiters of OSS didn't know who she was. But she was Ursula Kuczynski. And once I got that clue, I began to then spool back on her life. And she appears, she's almost like a kind of Zelig figure in lots of ways. She appears at key moments in the espionage history of the first half of the 20th century. And her impact was extraordinary, and we'll come on to that eventually. But really, in a way, it was by accident. And these stories have a weird way of kind of self-propelling, because once you start to dig into espionage history, there's an enormous amount in lots of different archives, in lots of different private places, and also in the memories of individuals. And so it was a really satisfying sort of job of excavation, really. But I took it on, I have to say, Simon, with some trepidation, because I mean, Ursula is a departure for me in 2 very significant ways. One is, of course, that she's a woman. And I've never written with a, there are lots of women in my stories and my books, but I've never written about a woman as a central protagonist before. And that was a slightly difficult thing to do in a way, because of course I am in some ways abrogating to myself being able to understand the way that a woman would think. And that's a difficult thing to do, particularly in modern times. But it was made immeasurably easier for me by the fact that her family allowed me to have access to her unpublished writings. And Ursula wrote a lot of books which were both published and unpublished. And they are really disguised autobiography. And getting to grips with what she was thinking and what she actually was doing, what she really believed at the different junctures of her life. So I was able in a way to, for want of a better word, to ventriloquize what Ursula was doing at different points. That made me feel much more confident about taking a woman's voice in a way and projecting it. And the other element was that, of course, Ursula was a communist. Most of the stories that I've written are written from the Western democratic perspective. Now, Ursula was a very different sort of creature. She was a fully dedicated communist intelligence officer for most of her life. And that, I found it absolutely fascinating in lots of ways, because it was a way of looking at this strange wilderness of mirrors, but through the other end of the telescope, to mix my metaphors. You know, it was a way of looking at that history, but from absolutely diametrically the other side of the fence.
Now, as you've been saying, and it's very noticeable in the book, it is an extraordinary window of 20th century history, and her communism was forged after World War I in Germany. She was born in Germany, and then she really becomes a spy when she's recruited in China, and that opened up a whole new world to me of all these spying shenanigans and rivalries and heaven knows what was going on in China in the 1920s and 30s. Was that new to you? Or
absolutely new to me. I mean, this was a whole area of history, partly because the Second World War, we do see it from our perspective, but the run-up to the Second World War, particularly in the 20s and early 30s in China, was an extraordinary story where a kind of a sort of brutal civil war was taking place that I knew almost nothing about, between the nationalist Chinese government and the underground communist movement, particularly in Shanghai. And it was a brutal, brutal fight going on, and something like 400,000 people were killed in the course of this terrible conflict, really, most of it taking place secretly. And that was completely new to me, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. But in order to understand someone like Ursula, and that was really what I was trying to do in this story, I was never trying to make an apology for her or to sort of support what she believed, because I don't happen to believe, I didn't share her beliefs. But in order to understand where someone like Ursula came from, one has to go back really to the chaos of the Weimar Republic between the wars in Germany, when this brutal battle between the extreme right and the extreme left was building up into one of the most terrible ideological confrontations of our time, which produced Nazism, really. And Ursula was born to a well-to-do Jewish intellectual family. She lived in a very comfortable house filled with books in Schlachtensee in the suburbs of Berlin, a world that was going to be absolutely destroyed by the Nazis. And she became a communist as a teenager. She saw the rise of the brown shirts. She saw the rise of fascism, and she believed, as many did at the time, and it was an entirely responsible and respectable intellectual position to take. She saw communism as being the only way to stop the rise of Hitler. And she became a communist at the age of 17, and she remained a communist into her 90s. So in a way, her story sort of covers the whole of communism, if you like. It's from its beginning to its chaotic and sclerotic downfall.
Absolutely, and that's so much what makes it a fantastic story. And it took her to many different places, and one never knows how many people have read Agent Sonya and how many haven't, but we don't want to bore the ones who have. It takes her to Poland, Germany, China, all over the place. She has extraordinary lovers, Richard Sorge, I don't know if that's how you pronounce Richard Sorge, but the great spy, the great Russian spy who infiltrated.
Well, he's the key, really, Simon. I mean, I mean, I think it's pronounced Sorge. I don't really know Sorge. It doesn't really matter. But I mean, she was in Shanghai with her husband, not a communist, an architect actually working for the British Municipal Council in Shanghai, when she was recruited by this extraordinary figure, Richard Sorge, who was described by Ian Fleming as being the most formidable spy in history, which is not far short of the mark, actually. I mean, he was extraordinary, and he was running really the whole underground Soviet communist enterprise in Shanghai. He was bankrolling, providing arms for doing all the intelligence work for this underground communist movement. And he recruited Ursula in about 1929 and became her lover. And he was not only a brilliant spy, he was a most adept seducer. And they had this very short but very intense love affair. She was married, although the marriage was coming apart. And in a way, I think that's one of the keys to Ursula's life. It's the intertwining of the emotional and the romantic with the ideological and the principled. And I think she never really disentangled the two of them. And although the relationship with Sorge was very short, it only lasted less than a year, and he was recalled to Moscow and would eventually be hanged by the Japanese in Tokyo, spying against them. I think he was the love of her life. She had many other lovers. But interestingly, when she died, the only photograph that she actually had in her private office was a framed photograph of this first lover, of Richard Sorge. And I think, again, as I said, it's really the combination of this kind of emotional pull and her ideological instincts that really, in a way, explain why she did what she did.
I suppose, too, the obvious central point of reference in Ursula's story is the fact that she ran Klaus Fuchs in England when the British atomic bomb project was underway, and he was leading it and the key scientist concerned, and she took over from another Soviet intelligence agent who had gone back to Russia. And that was an extraordinary achievement. She didn't get caught at the time, he didn't get caught at the time, and it went on and on. Has the workings of that, that's not I suppose, a totally unknown story, but when you really delved into it, did you find surprises or things that you didn't quite expect?
Absolutely astonishing, really. I mean, this was the pinnacle of her career. I mean, this was the end of the war and the immediate post-war period. I mean, I'll just paint you a little picture. If you had been to the little village of Great Rollright in Oxfordshire, a tiny, rather ordinary sort of little hamlet in the Oxfordshire Cotswolds, you might have met, as she then was, Mrs. Berthon. And she was married to Len, who worked in the local machine works. She had 3 children by 3 different men. She appeared to be a perfectly ordinary rural housewife. You know, she was very good at baking cakes. She attended the local fete. She went to church every Sunday. She had a very slight German accent, but she spoke very, very good English. And what none of her neighbors knew was that in the back garden, in the privy, she had built an extremely powerful radio transmitter with which she was communicating, and this is no exaggeration, she was communicating the atomic secrets to Moscow. She was running this, as you mentioned, this absolutely central spy, Klaus Fuchs, who was a prodigiously talented physicist, and a fellow communist, a fellow German, who was passing to her the essential blueprints of how to build the atomic weapon. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of fiction. And of course, spies are very aware of their own fiction, so one has to be beware of that. But every few weeks, Ursula would climb on her bike, appear to be going shopping for, you know, rationed goods down in Banbury. In fact, she was meeting with Klaus Fuchs in the Oxfordshire countryside and taking from him a vast amount of intelligence material. The Soviets did a little assessment of it, actually, a big assessment, after the whole thing was over, and they worked out that she'd passed over something like 580 pages of atomic blueprints, and which meant that when the Soviets detonated their weapon, to the astonishment of the CIA and the West in 1949, that was largely down to Mrs. Berthon of Great Rollright and her radio transmitter in the back garden. I mean, it's a most extraordinary tale.
One of the things that intrigues me is that the Kuczynski family was quite well known in academic circles and scholarly circles, and known as to be communists. and had come to the attention of MI5 when Ursula Kuczynski arrived in Britain in, was it 1940? I can't remember exactly. They kind of knew about her.
Yeah.
And yet she just carried on doing what she was doing. And I think you talk a bit about the sheer impact of the fact that she was a woman, and that makes life different.
Well, this is one of the central elements of this story, is that Ursula's greatest disguise, indeed her greatest weapon throughout her intelligence career, was her gender. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating that successive security services, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Gestapo, the SD, the Polish intelligence service, the FBI, MI5, they were all hunting for this person. But because she was a woman, they didn't see her. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. There are some records actually that have been declassified in the MI5 archives, which is in the National Archive. And there are reports in there that are actually very funny in lots of ways, in which, you know, the people sent to kind of try and, they knew there was a radio transmitter. They knew there was a radio transmitter operating in this part of the Oxfordshire countryside. And they actually interviewed Ursula at one point, but they believed, they were much more suspicious of her husband. I mean, it constantly, they looked at the men, and they were very suspicious of the Kuczynski family as well. Her brother was actually another Soviet agent. Her father had provided lots of information to her that she passed on. But there are literally these memos in the files that say, well, we've investigated the Burtons of Great Rollright, and we really don't believe it can be Ursula, Mrs. Burton, because she's far too busy with her domestic duties. You know,
you're rather splendidly withering about Jim Scarden, who was the MI5 interrogator. I mean, was he really that much of a...
Well, this is, I mean, Jim Scarden was, known as Bill Scarden, was the great celebrated interrogator of spies at the time. He was lauded by MI5 at every turn. The fact was, from my research, he was totally hopeless. I mean, he interviewed Kim Philby, for example, 11 times, and emerged at the end absolutely convinced that Kim Philby was innocent, that there was nothing to investigate here. I mean, he did eventually interview Klaus Fuchs, and eventually Klaus Fuchs confessed to him, but it was largely accidental. I mean, it wasn't that Scarden was particularly good at it. And Scarden did interview Ursula, and he was sort of so bamboozled, I think, by the fact that she turned up for the interview at her house wearing a kind of apron and saying, oh, I'm just baking a cake for my son. He just couldn't sort of deal with the fact that this was a woman. And so he completely ignored her and sent in a report that said, well, it's definitely not Mrs. Burton. We need to look elsewhere. And there was a sort of, she brilliantly turned the kind of sexism of the day, really, to her advantage. And she did it quite ruthlessly. She knew exactly what she was doing. In a funny way, in the same way that Kim Philby knew that his class and his education and the fact that he'd been to Westminster and Cambridge, these were things that were going to protect him. She knew quite openly that being a woman, being a mother, was her best protection, and it kept her safe for a very, very long time. Interestingly, though, there was one woman in MI5, a wonderful character called Millicent Baggott. Everyone in this story has names like that, and actually Millicent Baggott was the most senior ranking MI5 officer in the place at the time, and she was essentially running the anti-communist operations within Britain, and she was the only one who consistently said, I think there's more to Ursula Kuczynski than we're letting on. And she urged her bosses and her colleagues and everyone to take a much closer look at Kuczynski, and she was completely ignored because she was also a woman.
One of the characters who comes in here and who would be familiar to Spybus is Roger Hollis, who became head of MI5, and for a long time, particularly through Chapman Pincher writing about him, there were the stories that he'd been a Soviet agent all along, and it seems, and your book describes that it's baffling at times that he didn't seem to notice that the Kuczynski family were up to all sorts of stuff and gave them a free pass and whatever. I mean, have you come to your own conclusion about Roger Hollis?
Well, I have. I mean, this is one of the great conspiracy theories that continues to dog MI5. They're still quite jumpy about it. Even today, there is a sort of, you bring up the name and there's a sort of slight shudder goes through the security service. The essence of the conspiracy theory goes like this. Roger Hollis, who had dabbled in communism as a youth, had been in Shanghai at the same time as Ursula in 1929. It's quite likely that they met. And the long-running theory is that at the same time that Ursula was recruited by Richard Sorge, Sorge had also recruited Roger Hollis, who then returned to Britain, rose up through the ranks of MI5 and became the head of MI5. And the conspiracy theory goes, as long propagated by Pincher and others, that Roger Hollis was acting as a protector, not just for Ursula, but for a whole series of communists operating in Britain at the time. So I looked at this very closely when I was writing the book, and it seems to me that there are really only two ways to interpret Roger Hollis. Either he was a brilliant super spy who covered his tracks brilliantly for years and years and years, or he was basically incompetent. And I err towards the latter, partly because in order to cover your tracks like that, you would have had to have been absolutely brilliant. I mean, he did it over the course of nearly 25 years in the security service. And in order to do that sort of thing, you not only have to be able to lie brilliantly, you have to be able to remember all your lies. You have to cover everything. And no one ever accused Roger Hollis of being a genius. I mean, he was a kind of mid-ranking, rather dull, rather plodding bureaucrat. Now, maybe that was his cover. I don't think so. And I think there is a clinching argument here, which no one has ever, and I'd love some of the listeners and viewers to come up with the answer if they can. If Roger Hollis had been this absolute super Soviet spy, do we really think that Vladimir Putin would have been able to resist telling us about it? I mean, I think the GRU files would be stuffed with evidence of this if it were true. There would be files and files and files on it. No one has ever produced any. I think the current Russian regime would have been, which is of course naming squares after Philby and lauding other Soviet spies, would have been able to resist opening its archives. And the fact that it hasn't suggests to me that Hollis really wasn't this extraordinary figure that some think he would be.
Yeah, and I mean, reading your account of it and your conclusion, that is pretty convincing. I think I would definitely go along with that. I'm going to move on in a minute from Ursula, but I want to just ask you a final question about her. She was a Soviet spy through all the Stalinist purges, through the other terrible things that went on. And she got out of Britain in 1950, where it was exfiltrated, went back to the Soviet bloc. And then later became a famous writer, as you say, publishing lots of books. You write towards the end of the book, trying to come to some kind of summary of, I suppose, this tension partly between family and relationships and politics and ideology, and her feelings about ideology and her feelings about communism. What do you end up feeling about her?
Such a good question, Simon, because I really did end up quite ambivalent about Ursula. She is not a one-dimensional heroine. She's not a kind of female James Bond with a pistol in her handbag. She's much more interesting than that. And she is a complicated person. She's not a black and white figure. Yes, she was a Stalinist. She followed the Stalin line. She survived the purges. She saw hundreds of her friends and colleagues murdered during that mad, paranoid period. She never fully renounced Stalinism. She realized that she'd made terrible mistakes. I mean, in later life, she was deeply disillusioned, and she came to realize that the ideas that she had held as truth throughout most of her life, many of them were lies, but she still maintained that the idea of communism was a good one, and that it was merely the people who had administered it who had made mistakes. Now, that was a kind of weasel way that a lot of communists and former communists used to justify their actions. The other side of Ursula is extraordinarily attractive. I mean, I sort of partly fell in love with her. She was so brave. She was so tough. She was so resourceful. She's very funny. I mean, unlike most communists, I rather dreaded the idea of spending, 3 years of my life with a kind of didactic communist, but actually she's really good fun. She's very amusing about the whole thing. She loved the adventure and the romance of it. So there are two sides to her. I mean, zealots, and she was undoubtedly a zealot. She was someone who believed she was right, and that is an unattractive character, I find, in many people. She never doubted that she was on the side of the good, but on the other hand, I think if one had met her, she would have been absolutely irresistible. I think she was right into her 90s. She was full of life and vigor, and as I say, her story encompasses the whole of communism, from its sort of pure ideological start, if you like, to its chaotic downfall. And she's really an emblem, or a symbol, if you like, for that whole period.
In the time you and I have got left, and Lucy, I'm not quite sure how, I think we're about another quarter of an hour or so, but whatever. I wanted to expand a bit, and we can't cover all your work, but we can perhaps look at the 3 Cold War books, because they're all different, I think. And one of the obvious questions is, how do you get the information? I mean, are there differences in the books, and are you, with your contacts and whatever, fed stuff by MI5 because they want to get it out and they think that's a good story we'll have out there? Or how does it work, and does it work differently?
I wish that were the case. It would be absolutely wonderful if MI5 were to pick up the phone to me from time to time and say, we've got another one for you here. Alas, that it doesn't. I wish it did work like that. It really doesn't. Most of the material, I mean, all the material for Ursula, really, apart from the private archive belonging to her family, is publicly accessible. I mean, to go back another stage, I would not be able to write any of these books had the government, the British government, when did it start? About 2004, made a decision to change the approach to official secrecy. From that date, they began to declassify MI5 files, and those are the mother lode for me. They contain extraordinary information, really, that was never meant to be made public. It's all supposed to be secret. It's written by people who never believed it would ever come out, and so it's honest in a way that most government files aren't. When it goes wrong in real time, you can follow it going wrong, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I couldn't have done it without any of that. The slightly more secret element of it is, for example, when I was writing The Spy and the Traitor, which is the story of Oleg Gordievsky, who is the extraordinary former KGB officer who was recruited by MI6 in the late 60s and went on to spy for Britain and the West from deep within the KGB for many, many years, and he's still in a safe house in Britain. I mean, his story is quite extraordinary. Those files have not been declassified. Those files are MI6 files and probably will never be declassified. So for that book, I was very reliant on former MI6 officers telling me what happened, and Oleg himself telling me what happened. So it's a quite different sort of story. I mean, there's quite a lot of documentary evidence actually, but it's not from the secret classified files. So in that case, I'm relying on memory and sort of trying to work out the truth that lies within that sort of slightly liminal area of kind of personal memory, because of course we all have different memories, and often memories are contradictory. And one of the strange things about interviewing Oleg all that time was that I would occasionally have to say to him, actually, Oleg, your memory of what happened isn't right. I've spoken to a dozen MI6 officers who were there at the time, and actually they all have a different version. And he would be very interested. He'd give me a very hard kind of Slavic look. And then he would say, okay, well, you know my story better than I do then. But it was interesting because, so there are different places that these stories come from, but it's a wealth of material really. And it's fascinating. And I advise anybody who's interested to plunge into it, because the files themselves are absolutely extraordinary. And it's a wonderful backdrop to write about, really. I mean, it's, in a way, I often think that writing about espionage allows a non-fiction writer like me to invade the turf, really, that is normally dominated by novelists, by fiction writers, because these stories are all about those kind of themes. They're about loyalty and love and betrayal and adventure and romance, but they have this extra element, which is that they're true. You know,
can anybody go and look at some of the files that you look at?
Yeah, no, the MI5 files are publicly accessible at Q.
Right.
They're called the K files, and in fact, you can look them up online. If you go into the K2 files, those are, and they're still being released every year. MI5 releases another great tranche of this stuff, and they do it on a 50-year rule. It's an extraordinary thing, really. When you consider that, you know, to report the color of the carpets inside MI5 was illegal 20 years ago. You know, you can actually go in and have a look at this stuff, and it's absolutely fascinating. And really, I mean, I sound as if I'm a shill for the security service, but actually they're very good at it. The only things they will release after 50 years, if they can, and if it doesn't impinge on national security or individual privacy. And that means that there's very little redacted. It's absolutely extraordinary. You go through these files, and when it is redacted, there's a special sheet that goes into the file that says retained under the Special Intelligence Act of whatever it is. And often, you know, those are really, they're extraordinary, really, because you get to know the personalities who are running this story, and they're often absolutely fascinating in themselves.
Now, look, I can't remember if you said this in the Gordievsky book, which I read a little while ago. How did you meet him, or how did you get to him?
Well, that's a rather extraordinary story, because believe it or not, at that point, and we're talking in the pre-Skripal days, before the Salisbury poisoning, he was actually fairly accessible. I mean, believe it or not, at the Times, he used to do the odd book review for us. I mean, he written about half a dozen. And just on a whim, I thought, well, I looked him up in the sort of Rolodex, thinking there's absolutely no way he'll be there. And sure enough, there he was. So I rang this telephone number and got through to him. You wouldn't be able to do it now. I mean, he's now under the tightest possible security. And he was extremely accessible. I mean, in many ways, I think Gordievsky was very keen to get his story out there, that he felt that in a way history had rather moved on from him, that the Cold War was over, and that the effect of what he had done was not, and I think he was right, had not been properly understood or recognized. And so I think for him, in some ways, the book, while I'm critical of him in parts of it, is a sort of vindication. I mean, he is the most extraordinary person. I mean, he is really, sounds like a cliche, but he really is a prisoner of history. I mean, he lives in a safe house under permanent guard. He cannot leave. He doesn't live under his own name. He cannot go to the pub. It's an amazing sacrifice. I mean, there's a general point to be made about that, I think, which is that we often think about spy stories slightly through the prism of James Bond. We think of them as sort of moral fables, that there's a good and a bad and a right and a wrong, and that the goodies win and the baddies lose. That's not true of life, and it is also definitely not true of espionage. There are always human casualties in these stories, and huge sacrifices are made, and people get destroyed along the way. So these are not simple moral fables, really. They're much more complicated, much more interesting than that too.
Now, as a writer too, I'm very impressed by how prolific you are, and that you write a lot of books, and you publish an awful lot of articles in the Times, because and one wonders which is the day job and which is the night job and which is the weekend job. I mean, how long do these books take, and how, you know, have you ever put an amount of time to it? I mean, if you look at the bibliography of Agent Sonya, it's actually massive. I mean, you've consulted, you know, vast amounts of sources, and I find it quite hard to imagine how you actually encompass that.
Well, that's very kind of you, Simon. I mean, the truth is that the two jobs in many ways complement each other. The speed of the journalism and the sort of writing of a column and so on, something that appears every week or sometimes every day, you know, is complemented in a way by the longer form of being able to deep dive into a book and really immerse yourself in it. I mean, at the moment, I'm on a kind of 2-year cycle, which means that I tend to research deeply for about a year. And as my family will attest, I become quite hard to find during that period, both sort of psychologically and the fact that I'm deep in these archives. And then about a year of writing while still doing other research. And it is a fast turnover. But these are, I mean, I don't want to sound sort of faulty modest, but these are stories in some ways that write themselves. I mean, yeah. The Oleg Gordievsky story is the latter part of it is so exciting, really, that in a way it sort of just spools out of the page. It clanks along at a fair old rate. That so, funnily enough, I mean, that part of that book I wrote in about 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and it just tumbled out, really, which was wonderful. And you can sort of, in a way, I think that does give the speed at which one does these, does give them a sort of momentum, an internal momentum that sort of keeps them going, I think.
Now, I'm itching to ask you one question. You've been extremely successful. You sell in the millions. Do those who consider themselves, quote unquote, academic historians get a bit envious?
That's very yes. My father was an academic historian at Oxford, and I sometimes feel, he's alas long dead now, but I sometimes feel him looking over my shoulder slightly with his arms folded, saying, really, you know, because the sort of history I write is narrative non-fiction. It's not scholarly history. It is all true, it is all sourced, but these are true stories, or as true as I can possibly make them within the confines of a kind of scholarly envelope, if you like. But they're different. They are very different from academic works. I mean, there are frequent moments in my books when I don't know what happened, when the record doesn't show. And I often think that it's important that one tells readers that. You can't pretend that the world completely links up. So sometimes in the books, I have to say, we don't know what happened here. And I feel that's, in some ways, it's a sort of solidifying moment. It's something that you wouldn't find academic historians ever saying, because, of course, in academic history, you know, you're looking from above in a kind of much more omniscient way. That's not the way that I write the books. But yes, I mean, I've had also some lovely messages, particularly from my old tutors and things, sort of saying, you know, this is not how we do history, but some of them really like it too.
Going back to Sonya, actually, and taking up that point, there are some terrific passages when you are seeing the world through her eyes, and you're and trying to, you know, imagine what she's seeing and what she's feeling about it, and how that's impacting on her emotionally. And you said that, of course, you could interpret quite a lot of that from the fact that she wrote these stories herself, which were actually sort of autobiographical, even if the names have changed and the facts have changed. But I felt at times that, in a good way, because I like that you were kind of interpreting, or you were putting yourself in there and creating your own image and interpretation of her thought processes. Do you feel you were doing that? Were you doing that?
Undoubtedly. I mean, you use the word imagine. I never imagine what happened or what was said, because then you're writing fiction. You know, so everything is on a bedrock of what I know to be the case. So if I say it's a blue, you know, the sky was blue and there were cornfields growing, and you know, I know that to be the case. So nothing is ever made up. On the other hand, of course, like every historian, you have to take what you know and interpret it, because even the most sort of chest-crushing, you know, academic work is a work of interpretation, and to claim that it isn't is obviously wrong and misleading. So yes, I am trying constantly to imagine my way into what my protagonists are feeling and doing, and when I have their words and I have their diaries and you know, in Ursula's case, this extraordinary collection of unpublished writings, or published and unpublished, then you have, that's the gold dust, when you really do know what they were thinking at the time. And I'm constantly amazed by, as I said at the beginning, how much material there is. I mean, Ursula's own family archive, and her two sons were still living when I began this process. One of them has since died. They were astonishingly generous, and families can be quite defensive of their family stories. And indeed, they were quite suspicious when I first turned up and said, you know, I want to write your mother's story. They had been brought up in East Germany. They'd been brought up as communists. They weren't quite sure that they wanted me doing it. But in the end, they were absolutely extraordinary, and they let me have access to everything. And her archive, it contains not just these writings, but letters, diaries, postcards, and thousands of photographs. Yeah. And so I really did feel with Ursula, there was an opportunity to get actually properly inside. I think she would have she'd been furious about the fact that there was a book written about her at all, because she was also, despite being extremely open in her own writings, she was a spy. She was extremely discreet.
I think I'm going to hand over to Lucy in a minute, but one question came in that is a question that, of course, that I'd certainly like to have asked. Are you allowed to tell us what you're up to at the moment?
Yes, with great pleasure. I am, believe it or not, and this is quite a good subject for lockdown, I am deep in Colditz at the moment. I am writing the history of Colditz. Why, you may ask? There are many, many books about Colditz. In fact, I counted them up the other day. There are 73. There hasn't been one for many years. And many of the Colditz books, in a way, follow a very similar pattern. They are stories of brave men with moustaches digging their way to a different sort of victory. The real story of Colditz, and again, this is, I think, fascinating, is very different. I mean, the real story of Colditz is really a story about class and race and sex and what happens if you lock up 300 men for 5 years in a large castle in Eastern Germany. The answer is that all sorts of things that you would not expect happen. It's not a black and white story of sort of wartime heroism. You know, we inherited these stories, many of them literally black and white, from the films of the post-war era. The reality of those years is both much more interesting and much, much more complicated than that. So I'm deep in Colditz. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I spent a week inside Colditz. You can actually stay in it these days. And I'm thoroughly enjoying that. And as I say, it's been an oddly apt subject for lockdown, because here I have been typing away in my own form of You
didn't reconstruct the plane they tried to construct to glide out of it.
No, I didn't. The splendid Colditz glider, which of course was never actually used, and I think would have plummeted. I mean, I think the minute they tried to shoot it off the roof, it would have gone down without much doubt, killing everybody inside it. But thank God it never got. I mustn't give it away, but it was never actually flown.
Lucy, do you want to take over and do some questions from people now?
Absolutely.
That's been fantastic, Ben, me talking to you, but I'm going to hand over to Lucy, because I've noticed that on the screen here that lots of questions are coming in, so we mustn't give it away.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for your fabulous questions and brilliant insight into Ben, your background and your writing, and where it all comes from, and the inspiration. I've got loads of questions, but I'm not going to ask any because there's loads of questions in the chat already, and I'm sure there'll be a few more people wanting to put their hands up. So we've got a couple of questions to start with about Ursula. So I'll ask you both of those, so you can perhaps address both of them. Henry asks, how did her children cope with moving to the GDR, the German Democratic Republic? And Mark's asked, how did she react to Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin?
Very good questions. Well, to answer the first one, her children, she had 3 children by 3 different men, as I said, had absolutely no idea that their mother was a spy until they were in middle age. It came as a total shock to them. And even in very old age, Michael Hamburger, who I got to know very well, who was the oldest of the children, was rather stunned by some of the things that I was able to tell him about his mother. I mean, he was in his 90s by that point, and alas, he died before the book came out, but he did read it. The children had been brought up as English children. I mean, they had been brought up in the Oxfordshire countryside. The one survivor, Peter, still speaks with a rather attractive Oxfordshire accent. You know, his English, I mean, he's completely German, but that's the English he speaks. They you know, as children always do, they were very young, the little ones. They kind of absorbed their way into German life. But I think in later life, they came to realize, particularly Michael, that growing up in a family that was suffused with secrecy had been very damaging for all of them. And that Michael said to me shortly before he died, he said, I sometimes wonder whether I ever really knew my mother. And the emotional relationship between Ursula and her children is another of the central elements of this story, because Ursula really, in later life, she often wondered, and she wrote this, she often wondered whether she had been a good spy, but a bad mother. because she was prepared to put her family in jeopardy. And we're not talking sort of ordinary jeopardy. I mean, had she been caught in Switzerland, where she was running a big spy ring inside the Reich, had she been caught there and deported back to Germany, which was highly likely, not only would she have been murdered, but her entire family would have been wiped out with her, including her children. So she was prepared to put her children at extreme risk. Now, today, we find that quite difficult to deal with, and I found it quite difficult to deal with. But I think we have to be very wary of double standards here, because that is not a question that we would necessarily ask of a male spy. I've never found anyone who said to me that the problem with Kim Philby was that he was not a good father. We don't ask that question. And there is a second element to this, which I think is that, you know, Ursula was prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice and to put her children's life on the line, and everybody she knew. But there are characters in the Second World War who were prepared to do that, who we admire greatly. So, for example, French resistance fighters fighting the Nazis in the Second World War were also putting their families at risk, and many of them perished. They knew that if they were caught by the appalling Nazi law of collective punishment, that they would all be murdered, and yet we hold those people to be heroes. So there is we have to be a little careful, I think, of judging Ursula by modern standards of motherhood. On the other hand, that was also partly how she judged herself. So it's a very complicated issue, this, you know, and I don't think I ever resolved it. I really don't think Ursula herself ever resolved it. And I know that her children didn't. So there is, you know, as I said before, there are always costs to these stories. And I think the children suffered, and the one survivor still suffers in some ways from this. To answer your question about the Khrushchev denunciation, this refers to the moment when Khrushchev turned effectively on the then dead Stalin and began to expose the full horror of the Stalin regime. Now, Ursula, and this is no exaggeration, was shattered by that. When she came to realize exactly what had happened, and indeed, she never knew exactly what had happened, but she discovered that the mass murders that had taken place in 1937 and 1938, that had swallowed up many of the people that she loved the most, that those had been illegal show trials, that this had been a kind of appalling mass murder. She was profoundly devastated by it. She never really talked about it. It's the one question that I would love to have asked her, had I had the opportunity, is how much did you really know, or how much did you really suspect in 1937, 1938, 1939, what was really going on? Did you have doubts there? Her children are convinced that really it rattled her conviction deeply, and that she never really felt the same about communism. And when the Hungarian uprising was put down by the Soviets, when the Czechoslovak Spring was crushed, the Prague Spring, she also had deep, deep doubts. And of course, she left the spying game. She walked away from it, which is something that is very hard to do. I mean, it's a very difficult club to join, Soviet intelligence. It's a very difficult club to leave, but yet she managed it. And she, you know, so she was certainly, her views about the whole communist experiment certainly changed towards the end of her life, undoubtedly. And when the Berlin Wall came down, again, it was another moment of crisis for her. I think she realized that a lot of what she had fought for throughout her life was wrong.
It's really interesting how you really bring this human, real aspect to, you know, the characters, the people in your stories. You know, it's sort of like, it takes us away from this James Bond or this kind of very factual thing, and that is, you know, for me, brings it to life enormously.
Well, I wanted to make a point about that, Lucy, because I think what I've tried to do in these books is to give context, to try to understand why people behaved in the way that they did at the time that they were acting. And I think it's a really important point, this, because today we tend to see history as a series of sort of moral lessons. We pull down statues because they don't agree with what we now currently believe. History is not about making a moral judgment about the past. It's certainly not the kind of history that I try to write. It's about trying to put yourself into the skin of others. So this isn't, I'm not making an apologia for communism. I'm not saying that communism was right and everything else was wrong, or that vice versa. Capitalism is full of flaws. What I try to do is to try and put people into the shoes of my protagonists and ask a very simple but really fundamental question, which is, what would you do? What would you, the reader, have done had you been in Ursula's shoes in 1929 in Shanghai? And that's where history, for me, has real value, is in trying to translate. And Colditz is another good example. What would you do in Colditz? Would you be one of the people who tunneled out, or would you, like many of them, have kind of worked your way into an accommodation with the world you were in? These are important questions. And if we simply look at the past as a way to pass judgment, both on the past and on ourselves in contemporary society, that's a pretty sterile way of doing it, in my view.
And it also makes it much more accessible, I think, as a reader.
I hope so. I do hope so. It's it's all about context.
Penelope asks, World War II is a fertile research ground for spy activity, and obviously you've given us good insight into how you manage your research and where you've been able to access information. Do you think that the 21st century will generate similar stories, or has it all gone digital?
That's such a good question, and one I wrestle with, actually, because one of the lovely things about writing about the Second World War is that everybody wrote everything down. I mean, it was such a literate war. That sounds like such a mad thing to say, but everybody kept diaries, everyone wrote letters, everyone wrote poems and postcards and everything. So you've got this incredible mass of material. Today, we sort of imagine that somehow every time we write an email or send a text message that it's being saved somewhere and historians will be able to, but they won't. Historians of the future will find it really hard to access this kind of material. And also the material is being quite consciously destroyed. I mean, within the intelligence services, lawyers are combing through that stuff to make sure that whatever does get released is not going to compromise both tradecraft and individuals, and it's going to be pretty sterile stuff. I don't know how historians of the future are going to be able to write about this stuff. It's a really difficult question, and I feel very lucky in so many ways that the period I've been writing in and the period I write about is on paper. Paper is still the most permanent medium, and fascinatingly, I think lots of the modern intelligence services are going back to paper. They don't really trust digital stuff because it's interceptable and it's copyable and it's fakeable. And so, fascinatingly, I know for a fact that one of the branches of British intelligence has just invested in a lot of typewriters. Because handing somebody a message on a piece of paper is a lot safer way of being sure that it's not going to be intercepted, particularly if you only make one copy. So I think in some ways we're going back again. So maybe this will just be a hole in the record, but it's a question I can't answer, and I would not want to be a historian of this period in 50 years' time.
Well, I mean, maybe the answer is to as Julie Anderson's asked, have you ever considered writing fiction? I mean, maybe people will have to turn to fiction for this period.
Yes. I mean, I have. Of course, I have. I mean, it's sort of in a way very tempting. Although I slightly worry that my grip on reality is so tenuous anyway that if unleashed into a sort of fictional world, I would have no clue where to stop. Really. I mean, at least the things I write have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean, if and I'm limited by the factual information that I can amass, I think fiction, I probably wouldn't know where to stop. On the other hand, I would love to try one day. I think it would be great fun. Having spent so long in the spy world, it's so tempting to have a go at the fiction. And then the other side of me says, well, the truth is in some ways much stranger than fiction. I mean, if I were to write a novel about, say, Operation Mincemeat, which is a book I wrote some years ago, which is about to become a film, people would just think it was completely fanciful. It seems totally fantastic, that in a way it sort of would defy fiction. So in a way, I think I still find truth is not only stranger, but in some ways more intriguing than fiction.
Amazing. We've got a question from Mark, who's asked, have you looked into the Cambridge Apostles in detail? Was one of these the fifth man?
Yes, the great story of the Cambridge spies. Yes, I mean, I wrote a book about Kim Philby some years ago. who was one of the Cambridge Five, the original of the Cambridge Five, the one who set about the recruitment of pretty much all the others. Yes, I mean, yes, I've looked at it pretty closely. It's fairly well worked territory now. I think that Philby was much the most interesting. Well, I may be exaggerating, but certainly probably the most interesting of all of them. Certainly the most damaging. Anthony Blunt is another fascinating character. Donald MacLean is another good one. But these people have written very good books about them. I don't think there's many more secrets in that area to be discovered. Although I'm rather fascinated by the fact that while the Apostles and the sort of Cambridge spying are well known, much less well known is that there was an Oxford spying that was recruited at much the same time. The difference is that they weren't very good at it. And I say that as a former Cambridge student. They just weren't up to snuff, really. So yes, I doubt there's a huge amount more to be revealed on those. But the Soviet archives will be interesting. I mean, they were opened at one point in 1996. There was access. Canny and far-sighted historians from the West did have a brief period of being able to get in there before they were shut down again. And so there is still a lot more in there, I suspect, that may reveal stuff that MI5 and MI6 may find pretty embarrassing. Whether there's a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth man or woman, I slightly doubt it.
We've got Penelope asked, I mean, you spoke a little bit about your next project or your current project, and there's an interesting story that she's put in the chat. So Colditz is your kind of current project, your next project. Yes. When can we expect to see that?
Well, I have to finish it by Christmas, but I'm well on the way, I think. And so that will come out in the autumn of next year. And then the paperback will come out in the summer of the following year. So the autumn of 22, we'll see that one come out in hardback and then in paperback about 8 months later. So it's great fun. I mean, I had an extraordinary breakthrough on Colditz, really. I contacted the son of one of the American prisoners who'd been in Colditz, and I said to him, this was years ago, about a year and a half ago, I said, have you got any material from your father's time there? And I didn't hear anything for months. And then suddenly through the post, I'll find it for you, look. This arrived. Now, I've never shown this to anyone before outside, but you guys can see it for the first time. This is a scrapbook. Can you see it? That belonged to the head of security, the German head of security. That's in there, in Colditz. He was called Reinhold Eggers. And it's an astonishing private scrapbook of all. He kept documentation of all the escape attempts, and it's got hundreds of photographs in it, which has never been seen before, I think, or most of them. So that was an amazing breakthrough, really. And I've pictorially, I've been working sort of more or less from that. But so yeah, no, it's going to be good fun. I hope people enjoy it. It's not your grandfather's Colditz, that's for sure. It's a quite different place.
We should look forward to that. Is there anything? I mean, obviously you have written a lot of books. What is there anything kind of left that you want to really tackle? Is there sort of a burning area that you want to delve into? What can we expect after the next release? Well,
if anyone's listening, what I'm really after, if there are any spies out there, is I'd love to find a sort of modern story. I'd love to be able to do what I was lucky enough to be able to do with Oleg Gordievsky and use living witnesses to unlock. Probably it's a story about the Iraq War. It might be about Afghanistan. It might be about apartheid era South Africa. But I would love to find a story that sort of brings us up to date in a way. I've done my most recent one gets as far as the sort of late 80s, but I've never really, and I'm fascinated by that period when Glasnost and Perestroika brought the wall tumbling down, and we all in the West imagined that the KGB had suddenly become cuddly and friendly overnight. And of course, we now know from the Skripal events and Litvinenko and everything else that in fact, not much has changed in that respect. So maybe there's a story there that I can find. But these stories do depend on having access to the warp and weft of the material. You need to get really detailed records and people's memories, because what you can't do, I find, in a non-fiction story like this is to sort of jump between the sort of bridges that you have. You can't imagine, you can't make anything up. So it's a difficult balance to find something that is both modern and relevant, and yet there is enough documentary material released on it to make it work. So that's really what I'm looking at the moment. I'd love to find something that is sort of in a more modern area. So that's what I'm looking at now.
So yeah, any secret spies out there, please get in touch with Ben,
yes,
right?
easy to contact, yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was just a brilliant insight into, your workings and your stories, and so much. I have a feeling that we could have listened to you all evening. There is so much information and knowledge and history to it all. So I thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. And Simon, thank you very much again for your insightful questions and brilliant in conversation. Thank you very much everyone for joining us for the last of the Clapham Book Fest online events. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. So yeah, thank you very much, Ben, and good night to you all.
Huge pleasure. Thank you very much.